Okay, let's begin the talk for the evening. So, welcome everyone. We are very delighted to host Dr. Kevin Cokley for the talk on imposter syndrome, impact of imposter syndrome on students. Dr. Cokley has a joint appointment in the College of Education's Department of Education Psychology and the College of Liberal Arts, Department of African and African Diaspora Studies. Dr. Cokley received his PhD in counseling psychology from Georgia State University in 1998. Dr. Cokley's research can be broadly categorized in the area of African and American psychology, with a focus on racial and ethnic identity development, academic motivation, and academic achievement. A theme of much of his research is understanding the psychological and environmental factors that impact African American student achievement. Recently, Dr. Cokley has started exploring the imposter syndrome and its relationship to mental health and academic outcomes among ethnic minority students. So let's welcome Dr. Cokley.
Okay, let me pull up my presentation here. Okay. All right, so I think we should be set. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you are doing well. I'm Dr. Kevin Cokley, and I am a professor of educational psychology and African diaspora studies here at UT Austin. And I am very pleased to be here this evening to speak with you about a very important topic, the impact of the imposter phenomenon on mental health. And so we're going to go over this outline here. So we're going to talk about what is the imposter phenomenon. We're going to provide a definition, discuss some of its theoretical tenets, and discuss some of the ways in which it has impacted students in clinical and medical school settings. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research. I am a researcher, so I'm going to talk about a little bit of research that's been done regarding this imposter phenomenon and its link to mental health. And we're going to end with discussing some strategies for coping. Just a note before I get started, you'll see, and I think you all advertised this talk as me sort of addressing the imposter syndrome, and you'll note here that I refer to it as the imposter phenomenon. That's very intentional. The research term that we use is the imposter phenomenon, but I think in terms of popular culture and what you sort of hear people sort of talk about, you know, who aren't necessarily as well versed in it, it's popularly referred to as a syndrome. We don't like to refer to it as the imposter syndrome because when you hear the word syndrome, it really sort of suggests almost like a clinical diagnosis, like the word syndrome is typically associated within a medical context, and you think of sort of like having these sort of, you know, almost like medical symptoms, and it's not that sort of issue. You know, it's certainly psychological, but you know, I tend to avoid the use of the term syndrome, and so thus you'll hear me refer to it as the imposter phenomena, which, by the way, is consistent with the way that it was originally used when it first was introduced in the literature. So that being said, let us get started. So the imposter phenomena is essentially the experience among academically or professionally successful individuals of feeling like phonies and feeling like intellectual frauds. So these are individuals who are highly accomplished, much like yourselves, who've done well in school, who've done well, you know, if they're working, who've done well, you know, in their occupation. They've experienced a tremendous amount of success. But in spite of all of the success that they have experienced, they still feel like they are fooling people. They feel like they are frauds. That if somehow people could look inside of them and peer into their soul, so to speak, they would see that this is an individual who really is not as smart and intelligent and accomplished as your actual accomplishments might suggest. So this term imposter phenomenon is intended to try to capture that psychological feeling. And the term came about from two psychologists, who looked at 5 years worth of therapy that they conducted over time. They looked at individuals who predominantly, who actually were all women, and they were highly successful women, over 150 highly successful, predominantly white, middle to upper middle class women. And these women came from various backgrounds. Some of them were undergraduate students, some of them were graduate students, some of them were PhD faculty women, some of them were professional women. They came from a private Midwestern school and also a large Southern urban school. And they were between the ages of 20 and 45. And it was really interesting. And the way that it really came about was that Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, who were the individuals who were doing this work, they noticed that when they were, and they were both psychologists, when they were working with these individuals, talking with them and just sort of working with them, they noticed that they were experiencing this similar sort of psychological feeling. Again, these were individuals who were really highly successful, but in their conversations and work with them, they all sort of reported having these feelings of self-doubt, even though they were highly accomplished individuals. And so when Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, sort of, they got together and decided that they wanted to do this sort of work with individuals in groups, because it oftentimes it helps, to sort of talk about what you're feeling amongst other people who might be feeling the same thing. And so this is sort of where, the groundwork was laid for better understanding this thing that we call the imposter phenomenon. And so they went on to try to figure out, or to sort of suggest where this imposter phenomenon comes from. And they ultimately tied it to family origins. So on the one hand, they talked about, sort of having an intelligent sibling or having an intelligent relative. And so when you have, this sibling or relative who is seen as intelligent, and again, they were working with women, so the context here is women. They found that women oftentimes were told that they are sensitive or that they are socially adept. And the implication of telling them that was that they could never be as smart as their sibling or relative who was sort of seen as being smart, even though they very well might be just as smart as that sibling or relative. But when you're told that you are socially adept, when you're told that you are sensitive, it tends to sort of diminish, your actual intelligence. And so the individual seeks invalidation for her intellectual competence, but still secretly doubts her intellect. So even though, again, she on paper was just as smart as her sibling or relative, and had done just as well in the classroom, because they were really never validated by being told that they were intelligent, by always being sort of told that they are good in these other sort of more social ways, then they started to secretly have doubts that they were in fact smart, but they nevertheless still wanted to be validated for being smart. So that's one of the sort of hypotheses that these psychologists had about where the imposter phenomenon sort of originated. And the other sort of family origin that they sort of discovered was what they refer to as superior messages. So here in this case, the girl in the family conveys to the girl that she is superior in every way, that she is superior intellectually, she is superior in terms of her talents, she is superior in all these other ways. And she would always receive the message that she was very precocious as a child. And so when you hear these messages repeatedly, you begin to think that things should be easy for you because you're being constantly told how smart you are. But in instances, she would have the experiences where sometimes she actually struggled, that she sometimes would have difficulty. But yet she felt obligated to meet the expectations because everything that she heard from her family indicated that you're smart, this should be no problem. And so it became difficult to sort of accept the fact that, you know what, this is not coming easy for me. I'm actually having some difficulty. So she ended up, these girls ended up doing well, but again, it did not come easy for them. And so because it did not come easy for them, they started to internalize this notion that they must be an imposter. All these people tell me how great I am, how super smart I am, and yet why am I struggling so much? Or why is it taking me so much longer, to do well or to sort of accomplish these tasks compared to my peers? I must not be as smart as other people, or as what people sort of tell me. And so that was another sort of origin for these sort of feelings of imposterism. And so some of the observations that psychologists have noted sort of, in a, outside setting, is that individuals who feel like imposters, they have no experience of an internal sense of success. So in other words, again, even though let's say you made really good grades in high school, even though you might have done very well on your standardized test, that you still have a difficult time truly internalizing that you have done well. And of course, then you, as a result, you consider yourself to be an imposter. And in many instances, individuals believe themselves to be mistakenly admitted to graduate school. You're not sure, that you really deserve to be in graduate school, that it was somehow a mistake. Um, and in the event that you actually did receive high test scores, you start to attribute those test scores simply to just good luck. Or, if we're talking about a classroom situation, you believe that maybe there was a mistake made on the part of the professor or the teacher, that there was some sort of misgrading that took place. Or maybe there was just faulty judgment on the part of professors. The individual feels overvalued by your colleagues. So when your colleagues are sort of talking to you and telling you how great you are, patting you on your back, just sort of, really just giving you all of this praise, you believe that it's too much. You believe that they are really overvaluing your contributions. And here's the key thing to remember, that repeated successes did not sort of break this cycle, that these individuals still nevertheless feel like imposters. Some of the observations that we know happens in graduate school is having concerns about not being smart enough to retain all the knowledge that you have been exposed to. You still end up feeling inadequate, and you still feel inferior. And the thing about it is that these feelings of imposterism, they follow professionals through each stage of their careers. And later on in this talk, I'm going to give you some examples of some very prominent professionals who you might think would never feel this way, and yet it has followed them. So that's a key point to remember. Another sort of observation that we have is that individuals who feel like imposters, they believe that everyone else is impressive, that everyone else is smart and confident, except for themselves. And while we know that this happens for all individuals, regardless of race and ethnicity and cultural background, we also know that it does with students of color. There are some particular racialized concerns. These racialized concerns tend to be related to maybe feeling like you are fulfilling a diversity quota. That should be quota, not quota. I apologize. So that even though again you have done well, that you find yourself in a setting where maybe you are a minority, and your concerns and feelings around imposterism somehow begin to sort of take on a more sort of racialized aspect. Now, I want to walk you through this this imposter cycle, because I think that seeing it in this diagram will be really helpful for you to sort of perhaps apply to yourself. So let's start with you have a project or a task. So let's say that either you are you have a project that you sort of have to get done by a certain date, or maybe there's a test that that you have in a week or so, 2 weeks, or whatever the case is, and you need to sort of prepare for that test, or you need to prepare for that project or task. Sort of thinking about this, of course, leads to some anxiety, perhaps some self-doubt. You're sort of worried about doing well on this project or task or test. And there are two psychological pathways that you are likely to take if you feel like an imposter. The first pathway, we'll go to the left, is the pathway of over preparation. And I'll use myself as an example. Now, I have been publishing about the imposter phenomenon since around 2013. I have, several, highly cited publications on this topic. I have given more talks than I care to count. I have been cited by the New York Times. I have done, various sort of talks for other groups. So you might, consider myself, to be somewhat of an expert on this. And you would think that I could just sort of, without any sort of problem, just give a talk about this topic because I have done so much work in the area. Well, when you feel like an imposter, you engage in sort of over preparation. My wife will sometimes, really sort of get on my case because, she knows that I'm about to go give a talk, and she's wondering why I'm spending an hour, 2 hours working on a talk that I have given countless times and that I should be able to do in my sleep. But that's what happens, when you sort of, you sometimes have imposter feelings. You over prepare. So anyway, so you over prepare, then you end up sort of, doing the task or the project, and then hopefully then you end up, doing well. There's a sense of accomplishment. Then there are feelings of relief that go along with that. Hopefully, you receive positive feedback. People will tell you did a great job. If you're giving a talk, or the positive feedback can come in the form of getting a good test grade or doing well on the project. So whatever the feedback is, you end up getting sort of positive feedback. But then if you are suffering from imposter feelings, you tend to sort of discount or minimize that feedback. And you attribute your success just to effort. So in other words, it's not that you believe yourself really to be an expert. It's not that you really believe yourself to have all of this knowledge. It's that you believe that you are a hard worker, that you had to sort of put in all of those hours of time and energy and preparation and effort, just to be able to sort of do well. So not that you've got this, not that you really are truly an expert and really incredibly intelligent and competent, but simply you are able to pull it off because of your effort. So that's one pathway that you find amongst people feeling like an imposter. The other pathway is the procrastination pathway. Here, again, you have a project or task or test. You again feel anxiety, self-doubt, and worry. But instead of taking the pathway of over preparation, there's the pathway of procrastination. You keep putting it off. You've had that date on your calendar, and when you have to do the project or task or test, and that you need a certain amount of time to get it done and get it done well. And yet you continue to procrastinate. You say, well, I'll start tomorrow, or I'll start the day after, and you keep putting it up until finally it gets to the point where you cannot put it off any longer without there being dire consequences, in terms of doing poorly. So you finally end up, doing the work that you need to do at a relatively last minute, but you pull it off, and again, you pull it off. There's accomplishment. You feel, relief. You get positive feedback in the form of, getting a good grade. Being told that you did a good job with your talk or whatever the case is. But instead of, again, allowing yourself to believe that you really, pulled it off because you are smart and because you are an expert and because you really had this, you simply, you attribute it to luck. You say, well, I didn't really deserve, getting that good grade or getting that positive feedback. I was just lucky. And so because you attribute, your accomplishment, to luck, then again, you are discounting the positive feedback. So whether it's the pathway of over preparation or the pathway of procrastination, in both instances, you end up discounting the positive feedback. And so because you discount the positive feedback, again, you still have these feelings of perceived fraudulence. You still somehow see yourself as being a fraud. And it increases your feelings and level of sort of self-doubt, which can lead to, feelings of depression and anxiety. And the cycle sort of repeats itself, and it continues on over and over and over again. And one of the, one of the slides that I really like showing is this slide by Maya Angelou. So if those of you who, are familiar with, great poets and poetesses, Maya Angelou should be familiar with you. Maya Angelou said, "I have written 11 books, but each time I think, uh-oh, they're going to find me out now. I've run a game on everybody and they're going to find me out." And when you think about it, someone at her level, sort of saying that is really quite remarkable. Someone else that you might be familiar with, our past president's wife, Michelle Obama, First Lady. She describes her battles with the imposter phenomenon. So I want to play this clip for you. Uh-oh, let's go back. Let's try that again.
To enter into an elite school when your high school counselor has told you're not good enough, when all of society sort of looks at kids of color or kids from poor communities or rural communities as not belonging. I, like many others, walked into that school with a stigma in my own head. More young people nowadays call it imposter syndrome. I don't know if they call it that in Britain, where kids like me feel like they don't belong. And I had to work to overcome that question that I always ask myself, am I good enough? And I write about that. That's a question that has dogged me for a good part of my life. Am I good enough to have all of this? Am I good enough to be the First Lady of the United States? And I think that many women, and definitely many young girls of all backgrounds, walk around with that question. But how I overcame that is how I overcome anything: hard work. So whenever I doubted myself, I just told myself, let me put my head down and do the work. And I would let my work speak for itself. And I still find that I do that. I still feel that at some level, I have something to prove because of the color of my skin, because of the shape of my body, because of who knows how people are judging me.
So again, when you think about it, Michelle Obama, who has an Ivy League JD, who obviously is very accomplished in her own right, it's pretty extraordinary that she would have these sort of feelings of imposterism. Here's another clip that I'd like to play for you.
Now, with that surprise revelation from Viola Davis, the new Oscar winner, telling Amy just moments after that that she suffers from something that a lot of women do.
It's surprising, but then if you really think about it, a lot of women are in the same boat that Viola Davis is, and it's something millions of Americans face, where despite all of your success, you sometimes feel like a fraud. Viola revealing that she struggles with it as well, so take a look. She's now an Oscar award-winning actress.
And the Oscar goes to Viola Davis.
I became an artist, and thank God I did, because we are the only profession that celebrates what it means to live a life.
High achievements, but like many, Davis still battles with doubts, as she revealed backstage after the Oscars. Tell me how that feels.
It feels like my hard work is paid off, but at the same time, I still have the imposter syndrome.
That term, imposter syndrome, is a concept psychologists coined for feeling a sense of phoniness despite evidence of high achievement.
I still feel like, I'm going to wake up and everybody's going to see me for the hack I am. I still feel like when I walk on the set that I'm starting from scratch until I realize, okay, I do know what I'm doing. I'm human.
Some researchers estimate at least 70% of people will experience this imposter phenomenon, and some believe it affects more women than men.
I know I'm not the best, but I'm proud of myself. This is the first year I've allowed myself just a little bit to see that, to realize that self-deprecation is not the answer to humility. That sometimes you could say, I deserve it. that I'm proud of myself and move on.
Well, thank you, Amy, for bringing that to us. And joining us now is psychiatrist Dr. Janet Taylor.
So if we were meeting in person, one of the things that I would do would be to ask you all, by show of hands, how many of you have ever experienced feeling like an imposter? Because I would take that and I would just do sort of a quick mental count to see if there would be. I see one person has already raised their hand. I guess we can actually do that. I forget the things that we can do in this Zoom medium. So why don't we do that? How many of you have ever felt at any point in time felt like an imposter by show of hands? Okay, I see 6. Okay. I see six hands. And so oftentimes when I ask this question, there will be, at least 70% of the audience who raised their hands, and sometimes there will be more. The other thing that I want to sort of, point out is that while, the research, certainly sort of started off with this belief that the imposter phenomenon was more prevalent amongst women, and that's something that that many people believe. The actual research does not necessarily support that. In my own studies, one of which I'll talk about momentarily, but in my own research, I've conducted a few studies, and the studies have been somewhat equivocal. In some instances, I have found that women experience sort of high, more feelings of imposterism than men. But in other studies, I found there to be no difference. And in fact, that's pretty much reflective of the literature itself, where the results are not necessarily consistent that women are more likely to feel imposter feelings than men. So I found it to be really interesting, and I think it's important to point out, because again, that is the commonly held belief, but is not necessarily supported by the research.
Now,
and one of the things that we know is that imposter feelings, are especially prevalent among students of color. And so part of what I've tried to do in my work is to reconceptualize the imposter phenomenon through a more a culturally appropriate lens. We know that students of color oftentimes must overcome significant challenges to obtain, a college degree, including, being in racially hostile campuses sometimes, feeling a sense of marginalization amongst their peers, and experiencing racism from their peers and faculty. I have this example, and this example is really one that you might have heard of before. It was a story about a Black student at Yale University who was sleeping, and I want you to see what happened to her.
The outrage at Yale University, a Black graduate student, after she fell asleep in a common room of her dorm, and then the police were called. Here's ABC's Lindsay Davis.
Growing frustration tonight after yet another instance of police being called to investigate a Black person carrying out a routine act. The latest target was taking a nap.
I have every right to call the police. You cannot sleep in that room.
This white student called police on a Black graduate student who fell asleep while writing a paper in the dorm's common area.
I was sleeping on the couch and said, you're not supposed to be here. Why are you sleeping here?
4 officers respond.
Once we verify that you're a resident here, we'll be on our way.
Cianbola unlocks her door to prove she lives there, but police still want to see ID. She turns it over, but is detained 15 minutes when the name doesn't exactly match their records.
I deserve to be here. I pay tuition like everybody else. I'm not going to justify my existence here.
Cianbola tells police the same woman called police on her friend, a fellow student, in March. That student says when he asked for directions, she responded,
"You're making me uncomfortable. I don't feel safe around you. You're an intruder. You need to get out. You need to leave."
In response to this week's incident, Yale released a statement saying Yale police followed procedures and added that police admonished the student who made the call.
The vice president for student life issued a statement saying she is deeply troubled by this incident and that they now plan to hold listening sessions. She went on to say, "We still have so much more to do." David.
Lindsay, thank you.
Hi, everyone.
So again, when I do this presentation, I ask questions, and you don't need to answer the questions out loud here, but you can certainly answer them to yourself. You know, why do you think the student called the police? Do you think there was any bias involved? Were there stereotypes involved? Do you think the police would have called if the student had been white? And most importantly, for the purposes of this presentation, do incidents like this contribute to imposter feelings among students of color? You know, knowing that you have earned your place, that you have just as much right to be there as anyone else, and to nevertheless be sort of questioned in this sort of way. And, you know, and this is just one of many different types of examples of racial microaggressions that you might experience if you're a student of color, that could really contribute to feeling like an imposter. And so one of the things that we know is that imposter feelings are linked, you know, to mental health. Being high in feelings of imposterism has been linked to symptoms of depression, of generalized anxiety, and of low self-esteem. High imposter feelings have also been linked to poor mental health and increased levels of depression and anxiety among ethnic minority students. And some of my research has found this to be the case. And so again, being high in imposter feelings linked to symptoms of depression, generalized anxiety, low self-esteem. And we see, especially amongst, you know, certain, I've never done research with engineering students, and I would love to do research with this group. But what we do know is that among health professional students, for example, imposter feelings have been associated with higher psychological distress and perfectionism. But again, just thinking about engineering students, my guess is that imposter feelings would be quite prevalent amongst this group. That is a research study waiting to happen. All right, so I want to just tell you about a little bit about this first study that I published, because I think that you'll find it interesting. The purpose of the study was to examine the degree to which minority status stress and imposter feelings predict mental health in a sample of high achieving students of color. Recruited through my department. I had 240 self-identified ethnic minority students. There were 111 Asian American students, 76 Latinx students, 50 African American students, 3 biracial students who were excluded from the analysis. I had 148 women and 90 men. And it was interesting, and these were the measures that I used. So it was interesting. So we found that imposter feelings, in fact, were linked to symptoms of depression and generalized anxiety, distress, and low self-esteem. But we also found that imposter feelings were a more powerful predictor of mental health than minority status stress. And now, one question that I would like to ask, you can tell I'm so used to doing this in person, because I'm imagining myself sort of, you know, standing in front of you and really sort of interacting with you in a way that would allow me to sort of, you know, hear your response. But we do, I think, do we have a chat function? So let me ask you this question. So in this study, you know, given, I see someone, okay. So given the sample of ethnic minority students that I had, what group of students would you hypothesize would have had the highest feelings of imposterism? Again, you remember, I had Asian American students, I had Latinx students, and I had African American students. So among that group of students, what group would you say would have had the highest feelings of imposterism? So I don't know if you can you write in the chat, or I don't know if anyone want to just sort of say something. Let's go, let's see. All right, all right, so I see someone said African American or Latinx. I see someone else says African American, someone else says African American with a question mark. Anyone else want to offer thoughts? Okay. And so whenever I ask that question, I see another African American response. So it looks like most of you all who have responded believe that it would be the African Americans with one Latinx response. And then one person says privately Asian Americans and then Latinx. Okay, so let's go to our results. And if I can get my slide to advance here, there we go. All right, so a couple of different things. So African Americans reported significantly higher minority status stress than Asian American and Latinx students. Now, again, not imposter feelings. You remember I had a couple of different variables. We had the imposter phenomenon sort of variable, and we also had minority status stress. So African American students did report significantly higher minority status stress than Asian American and Latinx students. Asian American students reported significantly lower psychological well-being than African American and Latinx students. And then here's the kicker. Asian American students also reported significantly higher imposter feelings than both African American and Latinx students. Now, this was completely contrary to what we would have thought. So since our chat responses worked pretty well, what could you share maybe some thoughts about why Asian American students ended up reporting significantly higher imposter feelings than African American and Latinx students? All right, let's see. See, someone says social expectation, question mark. I see another person that says model minority myth, question mark, okay. Yeah, those are certainly, I think, high standards, pressure. Someone else says cultural differences. Someone says a multidimensional scenario, but mostly social cultural aspects. Those are all, I think, all very, very interesting and probable responses. But as you might imagine, my research team, someone that says higher expectation from the minority community, interesting. So we were left to try to explain these unexpected results. So let me just advance the slide here. So just a note before I sort of share, what we sort of speculated. One of the things to note about imposter feelings is that they are individual perceptions about individual competence and success. They're not individual perceptions about group competence and success. At least that's the way that a more traditional conceptualization of imposter feelings would proceed. So in other words, it's, psychology is a social science that focuses on the individual. So imposter feelings are really believed to be sort of focused on how the individual, herself or himself, perceives their own competence and success. And it's not linked to perceptions about the group. Again, this was sort of like the traditional way of thinking about it. Imposter feelings have also been linked to irrational beliefs around high self expectations. And then some of you sort of mentioned this. Cultural pressures of high parental expectations and the stressor of being a model minority, we believe may contribute to higher imposter feelings among Asian American students. It's been so interesting, when I've sort of presented this research in different places. And I remember, I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I remember giving a version of this talk, I think at the University of Michigan. And when I asked the question, and people, and many other people in the audience, did exactly what you all did. They sort of guessed that it would either be African Americans or Latinx students. But there was an Asian American student in the audience who was like, I think it would be Asian Americans. And then, of course, when it turned out to be the case, she, I think it was a woman, she was not surprised. I've done, other studies where while there was not statistical significance, there was still a trend for Asian American students to have higher imposter feelings than both Latinx and African American students. So I find this to be really fascinating, as a psychologist who focuses on race, ethnicity, and culture. And so part of what we need to do, as researchers, is to really sort of design studies that can help us really better understand if there in fact truly is sort of these cultural differences around imposter feelings, and if it is really the case that that Asian American students do sort of consistently experience higher imposter feelings. Now, I want to be clear and make sure that you all understand that all of these students, all of these ethnic minority students, had imposter feelings that were pretty high. So it wasn't like imposter feelings weren't prevalent amongst African American students or among Latinx students. We're just simply saying that comparatively speaking, that Asian American students had even higher imposter feelings compared to the already high feelings that existed amongst African American students and Latinx students. So as I sort of wind down here, I want to leave you with some strategies that you can engage in for coping, and these are not meant to be sort of necessarily comprehensive, but just some strategies that might be helpful. Providing an informal support network for each other. For example, creating a network of students where you can sort of get together in a safe place where you know that you're not the only one who's experiencing certain things, and where you can sort of, and that's not a counseling, sort of group or a therapy group, but it really is a group where you can go and just sort of be yourself, and where you can sort of talk about what it's like to sort of, experience your educational environment from the vantage point of just fill in the blank, from being, being a Latinx student, being a student of Asian descent, being a student of African descent, or whatever the case is. So we find that sort of providing this informal support network for each other is pretty helpful for coping. Now, I'm a psychologist, so I would be remiss if I did not sort of say that you should not be afraid or embarrassed to seek treatment for mental health. Sometimes when we experience imposter feelings to the point where they become somewhat debilitating or really, harmful, you really need to seek professional help. And so we always suggest that individuals not be afraid or embarrassed to seek, mental health treatment when you need it. And then here's one thing that you can sort of just simply do yourself, and that is keeping a record of positive feedback. Now, why is this important? Well, one of the things that people who feel like imposters do is that they tend to discount or minimize all the good things, all the successes that they have. And so we suggest that, when, maybe sort of keeping either a weekly diary, maybe make it a monthly diary, where you just sort of, you are very intentional about writing down or recording all the accomplishments and all the positive feedback that you've gotten. When you did well on that, test, when you did well on that assignment, whatever the case is, just sort of, making note of it, just, documenting it. And then, after, a week or maybe after a month or whatever the period of time is, just sort of going back to remind yourself of the successes that you have actually had. Because again, it becomes way too easy for those of us who might feel like imposters sometimes. It becomes way too easy to just invalidate or to just not acknowledge, the good things that you have actually done and accomplished. And so we suggest that being intentional and recording, positive feedback as you experience it is very helpful for your mental health. And so on that note, I am going to stop right here. I've been speaking for about 45 minutes, and I am happy to engage in a short Q&A if that would be helpful for you. Okay, let's read this question here. How can the educator or mentor, okay, let me pull that back up again. How can the educator or mentor at early age help students to avoid getting or facing imposter feelings? Good question. You know, what I'll say is that, you know, what you can do is, you know, probably, you know, minimize the likelihood of experiencing imposter feelings. And so what educators and mentors can do is to constantly, you know, sort of reaffirm to the individual his or her competence, his or her intelligence, you know, making sure that they are always sort of hearing that there is someone who believes in them, someone who knows that they are intelligent, and just is not afraid to continually validate that message for the individual. And part of what I think happens sometimes, and maybe some of you have not experienced this, but I can almost assure you that some of you perhaps have. What is really damaging is when you get a message from an educator or from a mentor that will suggest that you are not intelligent, that you are not as capable as someone else. And that can really be very damaging to one's self-esteem, self-concept, and really greatly contributes to feeling like an imposter. So if educators and mentors don't want to contribute to students feeling like imposters, they need to make sure that they are very sort of cognizant of the sort of messages that they are giving to these students. I see another question. Has there been any study done on fresh international students who face a higher shock, since it also involves changing countries and experiencing a different system among strangers? To my knowledge, there has not been, but again, I think that is a brilliant idea for a study. And I think that there's a lot behind that question, because I agree with the premise of your question that international students coming into a new sort of cultural context could be very susceptible to feeling like an imposter, just because, you know, they're not as familiar with the cultural norms of the country. And so I think that would be a really great study for someone to conduct. While working in a group, and when a person performs less than the peers, how does one avoid or minimize imposter feelings? So are you talking about how can the person who performs less than their peers avoid or minimize imposter feelings? Well, I mean, that you know, if you are an individual who finds yourself not doing as much, you know, in terms of sort of contributing to a group compared to your peers, then that understandably is going to result in you feeling more like an imposter. So, I mean, I think that the obvious answer to that is, you know, making sure that you are working just as hard, that you are putting in just as much time and effort as your peers, so that, you know, there won't be any doubts on your part and any perceptions on your part that other people might look at you as though you don't belong. So really, you know, you have, I think, a lot of control among yourself, you know, to make sure that those sort of feelings don't happen. So your own effort and contributions can go a long way. Do you think that role models are an important factor to reduce imposter feelings in graduate students? And also, do you think that imposter feelings are related to mental health and stigma in minority communities? Definitely yes to that last part of that question. And do you think that role models are an important factor to reduce imposter feelings in graduate students? Absolutely, absolutely. So let me give this example. Now I don't know, you know, I don't know engineering faculty, because obviously I'm on the other side of campus, you know, so I know education faculty, I know some psychology faculty. There aren't many people who look like me, as you might imagine. My guess is that in engineering, there are probably even fewer people, if any at all, who look like me. So if you are, let's say, for example, a Black student, I would think that it would be incredibly important to be able to have some role models, some faculty, whomever, that you could identify with, so that you can look at them and see, hey, this person who, you know, perhaps comes from a similar background as me, they were able to do it. And by virtue of the fact that they're here and I can see them and I can look to them and I can identify with them, that can sort of help me sort of, address my feelings of imposterism and inspire me and motivate me to do the best that I can. And I would say that for any, individual who finds herself and himself part of a group where your identity is not very well represented. So absolutely, role models are always, I think, very important in reducing imposter feelings. And then I see another question here. Do you find that imposter feelings might be more prevalent for people who grew up in a more competitive environment or mindset? For example, competitiveness in American society? Good question. I have not seen, or I am not aware of any research that has examined that particular variable of competitiveness. But if I sort of think through it theoretically and just sort of logically, my instinct tells me yes, that if you grow up, in a very sort of competitive environment, that you find yourself being especially vulnerable and susceptible to feel like an imposter when you're sort of, always sort of competing with other people. And if you ever find yourself, sort of lacking or maybe, not doing as well as a person that you're sort of competing with, then I think it's only natural that you would, start to find yourself feeling more like an imposter if you feel like you are not competing at the highest level and competing well against other people. So I think that's a really, really good question. These questions are really giving me all sorts of ideas, new research ideas. So I thank you for them. I think we have a couple of minutes left. Any final questions? Oh, thank you. Yes, in engineering, there are a few African-American and Hispanics, question mark. How do I, as a Hispanic engineer, can help? Yeah, well, I mean, I think, are you already an engineer? You're a professional, or are you a student? Oh, postdoc. Okay, good. Yeah, and again, it's unfortunate because what ends up happening for certain minority groups, in STEM fields is that they find themselves put in positions where, they have to sort of do extra service work just to sort of, try to, bring more people like them into the field. It's not fair, but it's sort of, unfortunately, it is what it is. So what you can do is really, I think, make yourself available to those minority students who aren't very well represented, and just to tell them, your story, how, what were the things that you sort of experienced in getting to sort of your postdoc position, because I think it's so helpful when minority students can, again, going back to sort of representation and sort of role modeling, have someone that they can hear from, that they, can identify with, and who could say, look, I made it, and this is how I made it. This is my story. And so making yourself available to students who might have similar, educational or cultural backgrounds is really, really important. See, this fall, Texas ECE is starting a program to help students from my university and from Hispanic, I think it's Hispanic institutions and HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, think about grad school workshop to help consider research areas, grad applications, preparation, etc. might be an awesome option. Yes, that would be an incredibly awesome option. And let me say one other thing, and this is going to, I'm going to drop this bomb with like only 4 minutes left, and I probably shouldn't do it because I'm not going to really have time to process it, but I feel compelled to share it because I remember maybe a year or two ago, I gave a similar talk. I want to say it was an engineering group. It was either engineering or it was some other STEM discipline, but something tells me it might have been engineering. But at any rate, I gave a talk, and I had a black student, and this particular student happened to be, I think, Nigerian, if I remember correctly, Nigerian American. And she approached me afterwards, and she told me what it was like, being a Black student, in her STEM major. And she talked about how there would be groups, study groups, or whatever, sort of getting together. And these groups, more often than not, would consist of Asian students and white students. And that she always sort of felt like, or got the message that they did not think that she was good enough, smart enough to be in a group. And so it was sometimes this unspoken sort of sentiment that these groups are only for certain groups of students. And when she shared that story, and then I've spoken to other students, especially Black students and Latinx students, they have shared similar sentiments. And so what I would encourage you all to do is, if you really care about this issue, is to really disrupt that and to push back against that. If you want to fight against students feeling like imposter feelings, then you have to make sure that the environment is such that it is open and welcoming to all, and that there aren't any sort of messages being conveyed that certain groups of students don't really belong here or aren't really smart enough to be here, by virtue of the groups that you choose to be a part of. I know that's a touchy issue, but if you're really serious about this, I would encourage you to address that. So on that note, I'm going to stop right there, and thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cokley. It was a really interesting and informative talk. And before we close, I'd like to thank all the audience who have come up here today to listen to this interesting talk. And this talk was hosted by the IEEE Graduate Student Chapter, and we were with the EC department, and we're interested in hosting more talks. If anyone is interested in or have any ideas about talks or are interested in what we do, please subscribe to our list. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Cokley, once again.